Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar, Afghanistan's Earthquake, When a Disaster Meets a Humanitarian Crisis. My name is Patty McElreevy, and I'm the President and CEO at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's CDP, the number 4 recovery, to share and join in the discussion. And don't forget to follow us at Funders for Disaster. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings and to better meet your needs. And finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel.
Hey everyone, this is Tanya Gulliver Garcia. I'm going to just jump in. We are having some technical difficulties getting Patty connected. She's currently overseas. So Ruja, if you want to go to the next slide. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Charity Navigator, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Human Rights Funders Network, Network of Engaged International Donors, and United Philanthropy Forum. And we thank them all for their support. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that we are working from the stolen lands of many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural disaster of colonialism, as well as disasters. We acknowledge that when the US was founded, there were exclusions and erasures of Indigenous knowledge about how to appropriately care for these lands, causing environmental destruction and degradation, which has had a significant impact on disaster risk and on communities. We are committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit ourselves to understand where and how wealth accumulation has harmed people and the earth itself, and the complexities of philanthropy is connected to that truth. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and will always be Indigenous land. Please join us and acknowledge the original peoples and their elders, past as present, as well as future generations. During the next hour, the panelists and
During the next hour, the panelists and I.
Go ahead, Patty.
During the next hour, the panelists and I will. During the next hour, the panelists and I will discuss the following questions. What does long-term recovery look like in the context of Afghanistan? How do you navigate ongoing needs from the complex humanitarian emergency and immediate needs from the earthquake? How can funders support recovery while respecting sanctions? I'm not going to read all the statistics related to Afghanistan, but I want to draw your attention to a few. More than half the country's population will need humanitarian aid this year. Afghanistan still faces the highest prevalence of insufficient food consumption globally. Displacement inside the country or across borders continues to occur, with 700 Afghan
Okay, I believe we have lost Patty again. So Ruja, if you want to go to the next slide. As you all know, a 5.9 magnitude earthquake hit eastern Afghanistan at about 1:24 a.m. local time on June 22nd. The epicenter was located 28.5 miles southwest of Khost, near the border with Pakistan. It was about 6.2 miles deep, which makes the impact localized but extensive. Over 1,000 people lost their lives and hundreds more were injured. And at least 2,000 homes were destroyed, with 10,000 more homes damaged to the risk of collapse. And now it's my honor to introduce our special guests, and I'm looking forward to the information that they'll share with us today. Xiaowei Li is World Food Program's Afghanistan's Deputy Country Director for Program and Operations. Xiaowei served with the World Food Program in South Sudan and in its headquarters in Rome, supporting their work in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, the Philippines, and Laos. Prior to joining World Food Program, Xiaowei worked for US aid in Sudan and South Sudan on conflict migration and peace building. Her experience includes both strategic engagement and operational implementation in conflict-affected areas. Xiaowei has also practiced law in New York, Beijing, and London with Sullivan and Cromwell LLP. Hakmal Munib is currently working as CARE's Afghanistan Program Quality Coordinator. In this role, he oversees quality program implementation and leads technical support with a specialty in gender, knowledge management, learning, monitoring, and evaluation, partnership, and communication. Hakmal is a seasoned professional with more than 13 years of experience in humanitarian response, monitoring and evaluation, research and analysis, and civil society development sectors, as well as strategic planning gained over the years of work with CARE International on various projects with multilateral partners. And Federico Motka is the head of emergencies and humanitarian portfolio at Vital Foundation. He's a lifelong humanitarian aid worker and has worked for a number of European international NGOs across a dozen countries in the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, implementing responses to rapid onset natural disasters and complex crises. Since stepping back from direct implementation of aid responses in 2016, his work has focused on supporting efforts to drive more direct funding to national and subnational organizations, especially in contexts where the financial services sector has been actively de-risking. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. I know you're joining from all over the world and in various time zones, so thank you. Xiaowei, let's start with you. Can you talk to us about food insecurity in Afghanistan even before the earthquake? What was happening?
What we were seeing even before the earthquake was severe food insecurity across Afghanistan. And this has been years in building. So first of all, Afghanistan saw 3 years of drought over the last 5 years. And following the Taliban takeover in August of last year, we saw an economic collapse. On top of that, they've suffered from decades of conflict that has displaced populations, and impact of COVID-19 has also severely affected Afghanistan. And then more recently, we had the ripple effects of the Ukraine crisis with significant increases in food prices, fertilizer, and other agricultural inputs. So what we saw basically coming in just before the earthquake was that nearly 19 million people are acutely food insecure. So that means that they fundamentally do not have the means to provide for their own basic food needs. And WFP has been providing assistance across the country, across all 34 provinces. And that unfortunately has not been improving. And so the earthquake, on top of other disasters, has just exacerbated the situation.
Thank you. And what is the World Food Program doing to respond to the earthquake? And what do you do generally to respond to food insecurity?
In response to the earthquake, just to give you a sense of how quickly we respond to a crisis like this, the earthquake occurred on Sunday in the early hours of the morning, and by Wednesday, that very same day, we had teams deployed to understand the situation on the ground. At the same time, here in Kabul, we were making plans to deploy teams as well as food. So by the next day on Thursday, we had 18 fleet trucks out on the road to get to 3 of the districts most heavily hit. And by Friday, essentially 2 days later, we were able to conduct distributions to those most in need. And since then, we've been providing assistance as well as conducting assessments to try to reach those who have been affected. It's up in the high mountain ranges, and so villages are scattered, and making sure that they get the assistance that they need. So far, we've supported over 50,000 people and are continuing to do so. For WFP across the country, after August, we scaled up significantly. By the end of 2021, we had served 15 million people in Afghanistan. And we've provided, since in the year 2022 so far, around 19 million people with assistance. And this might include in the form of emergency food or cash to help meet their food requirements. We also provide support in terms of nutrition to prevent and treat malnutrition for women and children. And we provide school feeding programs to help encourage boys and girls to access education. And on top of it, there's the humanitarian crisis, but we also want to make sure that households and communities have the resilience to really be able to support themselves. So we continue to contribute to that. And at the moment, we're contributing around $55 million per month into the local economy.
That is an incredible amount of work. Thank you so much to you and your team and colleagues for doing that. And then how can funders, especially funders here or across the world, help in addressing the food crisis? Because we know it's going to be ongoing for some time.
It is. And in fact, what I am looking at right now is the coming winter. We look at, that winter is the lean season for Afghanistan. There is no harvest, there's little work, and it's harsh across the country in so many places. And for the rest, our funding needs for the rest of the year are a little bit over $1 billion. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it's because the needs are so high. For each person, we're only looking at about a little bit over $100 per person for the year. And so, but it's just because so many people are in need. WFP, we're looking at supporting 16 million people for the rest of the year. And we're already looking at pre-positioning. This very month, I know it's July, but we're sending food out to places that will be cut off during the winter. And we're pre-positioning, and that requires $172 million. And then lastly, I think it's just, we talked about the earthquake, but it's really important to remember other disasters that have fell upon Afghanistan. Around the same time that the earthquake happened, there was also flash floods across over 10 provinces in Afghanistan, and currently there is still pockets of insecurity that displaces populations, and we're mindful that they all need to be served.
Thank you. And that number is kind of stunning, both the large number, but also $100 per person. I think for those of us in the US, that sounds like a small amount, but when you multiply it by the population, it really is huge. Hakmal, I'm going to go to you. What work has CARE been doing in Afghanistan over the years, and especially since the withdrawal of US forces?
Sure, thank you very much. CARE Afghanistan has been working since 1961. The vast majority of our team are Afghans. We are a trusted provider of humanitarian assistance with strong relationship in local communities. CARE International in Afghanistan programs focuses on women, social and economic empowerment, healthcare, livelihood assistance in providing vulnerable households with cash assistance in essential food and food items. Throughout the decades that CARE has been working in Afghanistan, the organization has provided life-saving aid as well as continuous long-term assistance programs supporting the most vulnerable communities, particularly women and girls. CARE is providing life-saving support currently in the following ways: providing multi-purpose cash assistance for the most vulnerable households so that they can prioritize their needs with dignity, providing cash forward to communities who prioritize improvement needed in their areas, such as cleaning of irrigation channels, road repairs, and CARE provides cash to those who engage in these works. CARE also provides food assistance to vulnerable households in the package of food includes flour, beans, that was recommended by National Food Security Clusters. To help families survive through the harsh winter, CARE provides winter kits, including one blanket in clothing to help families face the freezing winter in temperatures. As WP mentioned, that's a plan that CARE would provide to the earthquake-affected families in the near future to those areas. Provided support to the small-scale farmers, including seeds, tools, fertilizers, livestock materials, training how to construct greenhouses and kitchen cooks. CARE also deploys mobile health team that are bringing critical health services to communities who would otherwise struggle to access medical treatment. The provision of essential health care for pregnant and lactating women in the treatment of malnutrition in other health conditions in young children or among the services CARE provides to this mobile health team. In addition to that, CARE provides services to the GBV survivors through health services and also referring to the appropriate services. Overall, CARE's current programming includes 4 main long-term program pillars: the health, equity, and rights that manages all health services that I have mentioned previously. That includes mobile health team, basic health services and trauma healthcare to the remote communities, in provision of nutrition services to the children and mothers, psychosocial service support, and also establishing referral map for the health services and also other services at the community level. Resilience is about recovery and supporting women economic and social empowerment at the community level, which is one of the CARE main programs in Afghanistan. That's about women social and economic empowerment, provision of livelihood support, and preparing opportunities for women to engage within the community both socially and economically. That also includes agriculture, greenhouse, value chain supports, farmers training. It also involves some road rehabilitation, canal cleaning, and irrigation structures. And also some livestock distribution so that communities are socially and also particularly IDPs are socially and economically integrated. CARE is one of the main other program includes community-based education to children and women and girls. Through provision of accelerated learning programming to girls, early childhood development opportunities for children, and lower secondary and scholarship programs to girls. The lower and upper secondary support is also only provided to girls in remote communities in the targeted provinces. CARE also supports school improvement plan. For example, in locations where there are excessive number of girls, but there is no space to enroll them in the classes, but CARE provides some additional space, and that's called school improvement plan, so that they can attract more children, more girl children to their schools. To support women, children allowance or acceptance in the schools, CARE establishes community-based school management committees, and also village education committees, and also parent teacher association. All of them are supporting the girls and women and children education. And the humanitarian emergency program CARE provides cash, multi-purpose cash assistance to emergency affected communities. CARE also provides non-food items, including winterization, hygiene kits, and more specifically, the dignity kits. Recently, last week, CARE provided beneficiaries in the earthquake-affected communities the dignity kits to reaching most, the women in those communities. We realized that women were deprived from the assistance, from the attention in those locations because those communities that were impacted by earthquake, they were already suffering from, the lack of humanitarian access because of the long-term decades of conflict and presence of the AODs that time. But now CARE reached them and they have a sense of that they have the They have been respected, and there are people who serve them. Care provides cash for food, cash for winter, cash for rent, and shelter upgrade to the emergency communities. So overall, since the July 2021, care assistance has reached more than 800,000 people through emergency assistance, of which 65% of are women and girls. And currently, we are gearing up to reach many additional communities and families in these days, in weeks to come. So CARE is a women-focused organization. In all programming pillars, we ensure gender justice, women empowerment, accountability to affected family population with a special focus on women and girls. Over.
Thank you so much, Hakmal, for that. And we are proud to be a funder of CARE's work over the years. You started talking about the earthquake. What are the needs you're still seeing after the earthquake that funders could help support?
That's a really good question. For the last 7 years, I was personally in the area where the earthquake was affected, was hit. So unfortunately, the earthquake resulted in a wide-scale destruction across all really vulnerable districts in both Paktika and host provinces. I personally visited there and I see the destructions, the scale of destruction there. In addition to the loss of life and devastating injury, the earthquake completely damaged critical infrastructures, including homes, health facilities, schools, water networks, leaving thousands in even more vulnerable to future disasters. CARE emergency responses started very quickly after the earthquake. CARE Afghanistan rapidly deployed mobile health team and worked to mobilize in-depth life female staff to aid workers in teams to reach women and girls in those communities. The support is still needed in scaling up this development. Security on the ground is also a priority concern. For example, the organization or CARE is being asked to, some organizations are being asked to target specific areas of people to address this. CARE is being incredibly conscious about transparency, explaining the criteria for beneficiary selection, how we work, and landing on local partners in our trusted relationship to obtain support once this is clarified. So going forward, it's clear that the multi-sector response is required to address all needs. According to WHO's recent estimates, almost 360,000 people are in need of life-saving emergency assistance, including education emergency, which estimates 50,000 are currently in need, and no one has been reached so far. Emergency shelter of the 326,000, only 17,000 region remaining are still in need of the emergency shelter. Food security in agriculture, health, nutrition, protection, wash, all also critical needs in those communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakmal. So a disaster itself is hard enough to respond to. What's the difference for you in recovery when a disaster occurs in an area where there's already a complex crisis happening?
Afghanistan is already in the grip of an alarming hunger crisis. Displacement, the high food crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the catastrophic economic crisis with nearly 19 million people now facing acute hunger. This earthquake is another devastating blow for the Afghan people who need our support now more than ever. Afghan communities need support to rebuild and seek resilience through improving access to essential services such as education, health, wash, and critical infrastructure. Additionally, displaced individuals should be supported to return before the winter season begins and they become at risk of greater vulnerability. Strengthening the protection and accountability, shelter needs, access to essential services, all needs to be supported with livelihood support, such as promoting home-based activities and women entrepreneurship, and also women's social and economic empowerment in those communities. Okay.
Thank you. And truly appreciate the focus that CARE brings to women and girls, especially in a country like this. Federico, I want to bring you into the conversation now, especially as a fellow funder. When you're already funding a complex humanitarian emergency, how do you go about making a decision about also responding to an immediate disaster that occurs?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, the way we've taken it is sort of, it's a two-step process. Number one is sort of looking at what kind of relationships we already have on the ground, particularly if we're working with, or we have relationships with well-established humanitarian actors. One of the sort of easiest things for us is to offer sort of immediate flexibility, or at least make rapid commitments to providing additional funding to respond. I think this is something that I'm sort of really recognized, is the fact that a lot of organizations that operate in such complex environments like Afghanistan, they're remarkably capable of navigating some of the challenges, and sort of and offering them that kind of flexibility, or at least commitments, will allow them to make that quick response. So in our case, we also sort of recognized that we didn't want to overburden some of our partners, although they might have been able to respond elsewhere. You know, there is a complex crisis, so we sort of took the position of, well, let's see who else is already established in the affected area, and particularly looking, given the context in Afghanistan and given the location of the earthquake, whether there was opportunities to look at cross-border responses as well. So, you know, reaching out to our existing network, offering flexibility to redirect funding where that was possible, but otherwise sort of making those sort of rapid commitments. Equally, you know, one of the things that that we're very conscious about, given the fact that there's such enormous need, and you don't want to too much sort of push funding from one place to another, you know, it was also about sort of understanding what we could do in terms of not necessarily looking at the very rapid response. You know, we had to make a sort of choice, look at ourselves and say, well, can we and can't we do? We felt that we couldn't necessarily respond in the immediate, other than offering that flexibility to existing partners if that's what they were looking, that's what they were looking to do, but also saying, okay, well, let's say that there is a capacity in Afghanistan to do that emergency response, as we've also heard from the other panelists. You know, we're perhaps better positioned to offer support maybe in the month thereafter, because there is always that drop off in funding, but that recovery period needs to be sort of supported as well. And the earlier that you can jump in, of course, the better. But you know, that looking at those dynamics is how we've approached it.
Thank you. And that is definitely something that we always think about at CDP, is there's that immediate response, but there's also going to be long-term recovery. So you have funded several local organizations in Afghanistan, and thematically your foundation's focused on women and youth. Can you share a bit about what the foundation has done, and how can other funders help support recovery and resilience in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so within our response in Afghanistan, we sort of took as a thread that we wanted to follow the idea of, we know that in contexts like Afghanistan, a lot of the coping mechanisms that are implemented at the household level and across communities is often to look at women and youth as sort of assets, in the sense of either sending youth into the labor market and taking them out of schooling, early childhood marriage. You know, there's a strong gender issue there. So what we tried to work with in terms of when we had conversations with potential partners, and a lot of the work that we then ended up funding was saying, okay, well, look, Afghanistan has had 20 years of investment. There are structures that were created at various levels, but you know, especially at the local level, provincial women's networks, self-help groups, you know, a lot was done. How can we connect with those and place women and youth at the center the aid delivery process. Because ultimately, as much as you want to get aid out there, but rather than impose a delivery mechanism, how can we actually sort of look at the structures that are available, the opportunities that there are for some of those groups that were created over the last 20 years or further, and put them in the driver's seat so that they're actually seen as active contributors to the community, and maybe sort of reduce, at least this is our theory, and reduce the sort of how they are seen maybe as passive contributors, or actually not even contributors, just as assets to be leveraged. So that's kind of where the path that we took. We fund a variety of groups. A lot of the time, the implementation is with local actors, but we've had to look at fiscal sponsorship arrangements and work a little bit creatively in order to get funding to them. But yeah, we prioritize actions that are sort of really looking at this kind of at local structures, how those are integrated and placed at the forefront, and really sort of also sort of taken a relatively open approach to say, we know that those structures, especially after August, even though they were there and they were invested in, they might have somewhat, I don't want to say collapsed, but at least broken down a little bit, give the opportunity, and the flexibility, offer the flexibility to take the time to restructure, to get to reinvest a little bit of organizational funding there, so that they then can take on that role as well. So we've sort of taken that approach. To look at both an immediate sort of ensuring aid delivery, but also sort of investing in the structures and giving them some flexibility to re-strengthen and recompose, I guess, themselves.
Right, capacity building is definitely something we talk about a lot at CDP. And then I know some funders are concerned about how to fund within Afghanistan given the sanctions. As a foundation that is funding there, can you explain how funders can support recovery and resilience while still respecting the sanctions?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. I think the issue of sanctions is at the forefront of everyone's minds. I think that the truth is that there are ways to work in line with the sanctions. I mean, there are very clear OFAC licenses, so exemptions around humanitarian aid. Partly, I think the larger challenge, rather than the sanctions themselves, given the environment that's been created, and a lot of work has gone in, and we have to recognize that and sort of connect into those actors that are well informed around it, including the United Nations. But one of the things that we try to do is to both look at, okay, well, how do we work regionally? Look at fiscal sponsorship arrangements where there are opportunities for that, but also sort of leverage platforms, advances in technology that allow for, whether it's digital money, looking at working with the financial services sectors. So this is kind of, for me, the issue is more around the fact that banks are de-risking, so they don't actually want to necessarily, or they create red flags or challenges to actually make money transfers. It requires actually working with financial services sector, and I think that we as funders have to take a much more active role. A lot of the time we sort of pass that risk and that liability, if you will, along to our partners and say, we'll fund you guys in your bank account in the US or the UK or wherever, and it's up to you to get the funding in. I think there is much more that we can do to actually support initiatives, whether it's social enterprises or businesses within the financial services sector that are looking to address this issue and actually work with them and bring more transparency in, because I think a lot of the time, especially working in informal money transfer mechanisms, etc., that kind of starts to disappear, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So it's a little bit a sort of recognizing that the landscape is complex, that a mechanism that works for 1 month doesn't necessarily work the next month, that it's constantly, as services are used, the more is learned, and it requires that flexibility. I think as funders, offering as much as we can, accepting that there are costs associated if you want to do things right, and ensuring those are properly budgeted and accepting them on our side is important. And really sort of working together. I think there's a lot of the time we're trying to fix our own issues, and sometimes there is a lot more that we can do as a community than alone. And there, whether it's through networks like Interaction or through initiatives, specific initiatives, there's a lot out there, and a lot of the time sort of working, if we actually leverage economies of scale and other things, there's a lot more we could do to lower our costs in terms of the overheads that are associated with it, ensuring that you're respecting all the anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing, etc., sanctions, and sort of making sure that you're not taking the banks along with a ride, and actually bringing them into the conversation as well.
Thank you. And we're going to come back to you in a minute. There's some questions further about supporting organizations in Afghanistan. So we have received several questions in advance. We have several questions in the Q&A. And so I'm going to work through both of those lists, and you are still welcome to add any questions you have for our speakers into the question and answer box. Just as a reminder, our webinars are aimed at providing education for the philanthropic community. So while everyone's welcome to pose a question, we're going to first focus on the funder issues. And, Federico, I think I want to go to you first to sort of follow up on that conversation you were just talking about. One of the attendees asks, not just from a sanctions perspective, but how do you reassure donors who believe investing in Afghanistan is too risky because of, having a sustainable, lasting impact in a complex and protracted humanitarian context? And Xiaowei and Hakmal, I'll come to you after that. But, when we're working in a crisis, it maybe feels like we're just putting money into an endless pool. How do you get donors to do that?
Well, I think a lot of the it requires a little bit sort of understanding what you think you can achieve, and being sort of conscious of your own limitations as a funder. I think if you invest in programs that really look at putting the communities that you're trying to support at the center of the delivery mechanism, at least looking at it from with the humanitarian hat on, so you're trying to deliver aid, ensuring that that whatever program you're supporting really is building on existing structures, and so much work has gone into has been invested in Afghanistan, and there's a lot there to work with. I mean, communities are not passive; they're very much capable of being active members, active participants in the delivery of their own aid. So really investing in programs that look at putting them at the center is critical. I think, and the reason I say you have to look at sort of where you stand, I think there's some organizations that simply have to accept that maybe that's too challenging and it is too risky. But there are fantastic international groups that do great work, CARE, WFP, etc. So sort of recognizing what opportunities you have in terms of what you think you can do. I think risk is very much is something that we have to. I think there's always risk, but at the same time, I don't think that you can. I think there's a lot you could do in Afghanistan that isn't necessarily any more risky than working in other contexts, and just sort of building relationships with your partners, leveraging, working with a community of actors and sort of connecting them so that each is supporting one another. That's what we try to do as much as possible. That is also something that I would highly recommend, and being an open partner, if you will, in the relationship, to say, look, talk to me about issues you're facing. Let's work together. Let me help you with the flexibility or whatever else that I can offer within the limitations that I have, and make sure that partners sort of recognize what those limitations are in advance. I don't believe that it's more risky to work in Afghanistan in terms of impact. I think it's just that they are very, unfortunately, Afghanistan has been victim of a lot of things that is completely out of their control. A lot of issues that have, geopolitically and environmentally that have happened. So, I think it's a challenging time, but there's a lot of opportunities out there.
Thank you. Xiaowei, do you want to jump in on this question, and then Hakmal will go to you?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the point that Federica just made about working with the community. So when it comes to pure core humanitarian needs, that's going to remain in Afghanistan for quite some time. But for us, we've also been working with communities and developing their resilience for years. And I've seen the impact of that. And I think it's important to recognize that there are possibilities for longer term sustainable impact. For example, just last month, I was out in Badakhshan province, where we've been working with some of the communities there for the past few years. And essentially, we started off with a conversation with the communities of what they need and what they would put forward. And a lot of it had to do with water management. They've suffered from droughts. And so we've been helping and working with them to build check dams, irrigation canals. And after a couple of years, they're now actually sustainable. In Badakhshan, where it's one of the most highly food insecure locations and provinces in Afghanistan, these communities, I asked if they're still needing food assistance, and they said no. So it is possible, but it does, one, take a bit of time and proper investment. Where WFP can come in is we're able to help fill the immediate short-term needs that they have. We, in this case, provided some of the engineering and technical support as they were building their natural resource management facilities. And they gave a lot of assistance of how they can take it forward. But essentially, we had a social contract with them that now they're fulfilling.
Thank you. Hakmal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with what colleagues mentioned. The operational environment in Afghanistan is very much tense. And due to multiple factors such as care navigating function, de facto authorities to help vulnerable populations without enabling the carrying de facto authorities in power. The decentralization of the carrying de facto authorities creates possible contradiction in evolution in policies. This decentralization also creates sense of negation of decisions in centralized authorities, and there is no consistency in adhering to standards and operating procedures for the whole, the de facto government level. But for organizations, they are aware of this concern situation, and they have established policy and procedures, particularly for care Afghanistan, to make sure that we have many, the standard operating procedures per locations to make sure that we remain compliant to donor requirements, and also to the donor requirements, and also reaching most vulnerable populations without empowering the de facto authorities. There are some ways, and I understand that international organizations are now currently working on the implementing a joint operating procedure that clearly, identifies the steps what to do and what not to do. And there is also HAG, the humanitarian action group, who is also supporting organization actively most vulnerable communities, and they are engaged in high-level discussions with the de facto authorities So there are some ways that we can continue implementation of the program without empowering the Karen authorities. The challenges are there, but they mentioned the organization. Our mandate is still, remain the same, that we should continue reaching the most vulnerable communities in Afghanistan, particularly women and girls who are being impacted by the current crisis.
Thank you. Hakmal and Xiaowei, maybe, and Federico, if you want to jump in as well. One of the questions is about connections with disability-led organizations. Have you connected with any that are responding, or are there humanitarian actors focusing on the needs of people with disabilities? Hakmal, do you want to start?
Yes, we are working with the local authorities, including the disability organizations, to make sure that they have been reached and their needs are being addressed. We are in coordination with them. We are also having a local partnership with one of the disability organizations who provides those supports to these communities.
Xiaowei, do you want to jump in?
Sure. For the earthquake response, we are working to look specifically at the needs of people with disabilities. As I mentioned earlier, the affected area is up in the mountains with scattered and sparse villages. And so to be able to access our distribution sites, where we're conducting joint distribution sites, it might be quite difficult for people with disabilities. And we're looking to identify who those households are and potentially see how we can ease their access to our assistance. And that's really true across the country and how we work. We do look at the special needs that may be true for people with disabilities and or other vulnerable populations.
Thank you. Federico, do you have anything to add to your colleagues?
I'm afraid I can't speak specifically to organizations that are disability-led, but one of the things that I would note is if your partners are really sort of working with communities and sort of genuinely focusing on getting them to sort of feed into the design and delivery of aid, a lot of the time, those kinds of needs and specific requirements of members within that get taken seriously, and there are ways to ensure that their needs are met specifically. So that's something that we encourage.
Thank you. And that's a good point, that, again, to emphasize the need to partner with local organizations. Xiaowei, a question for you and anyone else who wants to jump in. You talked about the remote areas that you're providing service in. What are the transportation and logistic challenges of delivering this aid? And then how does that impact the cost and your ability to deliver programs because of perhaps increased cost?
Specific to the earthquake, these locations are fairly remote, but the roads are certainly not easy to get to, but they're navigable for the main distribution sites. WFP has our own fleet of over 250 trucks and trailers at our disposal. And then we also work with over 120 commercial transporters, so that's how we ultimately get food across the country in some of the very, very remote locations where there isn't really a functioning market. One of the biggest challenges that we have, and I alluded to the winter. Winter in Afghanistan is very difficult, and these roads, while they may be navigable at the moment, in some of the passes basically get cut off during the winter, and they could get cut off for up to 4 to 5 months, from essentially late October into March or even into April in some locations. And that's why it's so critical for us to pre-position in advance. The costs are not, they're high, of course, but they're not actually as exorbitant. I worked in South Sudan before, where the cost for delivery is much, much higher. And that's also partially because the roads are so difficult in South Sudan, where we might have to do airdrops and air deliveries. For us to be able to pre-plan in advance, for example, with the pre-positioning, that allows us to deliver much more cost efficiently than if we had to deliver anything by air. We also oftentimes work on the roads. So WFP has significant logistics capacity. So where we need to help open roads, we've done that and are looking at the moment to assess the roads to look at choke points that might ease access, not only for WFP's food, but for all humanitarians to respond to the earthquake.
That's really fascinating. I never knew that about WFP. Hakmal, did you want to add anything about capacity in terms of reaching folks?
Thank you. As mentioned, colleagues also, the overall earthquake areas are geographically mountainous, and so far, from the center of the provinces to the earthquake affected communities, the roads are unsafe. And sometimes due to the heavy rain in the already destroyed roads because of the earthquake, the access to those locations becomes challenging. And the cost of delivery is much higher compared to other responses that we have in other provinces. One other challenge is that the women are not allowed to appear in the distribution site. For organizations, for example, like here, who would like to get assistance to reach women and girls in those locations. For example, when we distribute dignity kits to the women and girls, we need to go to the actual community, the households, and distribute them. And that makes the cost of logistics in delivery and transportation of those items very much, expensive and higher. So these are the challenges, just but the overall, we try to, as the colleagues also mentioned, navigate in tandem so that our assistance reaches the most, vulnerable affected groups, but the cost is comparatively very high.
Thank you. We are getting close to the end of our questions, but I have a couple more. Federico, I want to ask you a question. Someone's asking, there's foundation partners who want to support in solidarity, but they've been hesitant because of funding in a conflict area. Do you think this will shift given the grave needs arising from the earthquake, or that we're continuing to see as the humanitarian crisis develops? Will there be more willingness to fund in conflict setting?
I hope so. I mean, it's interesting because in many ways with the change in regime in Afghanistan, conflict is no longer as much of an issue. I mean, it's very different, isn't it now? So I would say this. I think that if you, rather than just providing support in solidarity, there's a lot that can be done around some of the challenges that organizations, and particularly local organizations, face. I mean, we have to say that one of the biggest issues is the actual money transfer process, and that's not an issue that a local organization will be able to solve on their own. I think it's there's a lot that we can do on our side potentially, whether it's investing in solutions that could help banks sort of not de-risk, I guess, or not see transfers as risky, and leverage the fact that there are exemptions to the sanctions for Afghanistan, whether it's to lobby, to engage with groups that are advocating for more exemptions, or even sort of dislodging of funding that is currently being tied up. But I do think that there are ways that can be supporting local organizations to access funding that can be done from outside, and that is something that needs to be looked at much more. I think there are some facilities that have been put in place, but they benefit a lot of the international actors, and And that's fine, but at the same time, more needs to be done to actually benefit local groups who are still struggling to get funding that they even have committed. It's just not that funders of donors, individuals are finding challenging to get to them. So, working with businesses, leveraging whatever clout there is in support of that is as important, I think, as contributing more funding to the country.
Good points. Thank you. And Xiaowei, I'm going to give you the last question. What are the main challenges in providing post-disaster and humanitarian aid support to internally displaced people within the country?
So a number of things. One is understanding how we can help them, either if they're returning or they're relocated, what can we really do to help them longer term? And there are a number of factors in place. Sometimes if they're returning to their place of origin, some of the crisis that we face in Afghanistan, they've been displaced for years. And so basic services from their place of origin essentially no longer works. When I say basic services, it includes schools, it includes health services, or even just water. And so we really need to make sure that we take a look at it holistically. We also need to really make sure that we have the funds to be able to do so. A new emergency tends to attract more funding, and I was very glad to hear, for example, when Federico said they also sometimes come in afterwards to recognize that after the initial set of emergency and immediate attention to a disaster, really there's significant amount of investment that needs to come in for months or even years to support them. So that longer term funding is required.
Could I just jump in very quickly? I would also one of the things that is often overlooked is the idea of actually supporting organizations that do pre-positioning. The cost per sort of beneficiary, for lack of a better word, in pre-positioning to actually sort of ensure that things are in place in anticipation of a disaster, given the context in Afghanistan, can be significantly more effective, efficient, if you will, than responding each time. So supporting that kind of work in advance is critical in my view.
Thank you. Great point. And so we are going to wrap up. I want to provide some thoughts, some actions that our listeners can take. As you've heard from CDP for years and from our panelists today, support local organizations on the ground and also support established organizations, especially those that are funding and working with local leaders, employing local staff. We want to get as close to the ground as possible. Fund both emergencies and crisis. So don't ignore an ongoing crisis because a new emergency arises, but at the same time, don't overlook the new disaster because there's already a significant humanitarian crisis. There's going to be new and emerging needs that your grantee partners are going to need to respond to, and so help them increase their capacity. And then finally, learn about the rules, but don't be afraid. Funding in a crisis in a conflict zone can seem overwhelming, but there are lots of resources to help you navigate the legalities. And then if you haven't seen it, CDP has a brand new website. We just launched a few months ago. There are tons of expert resources on there that you can use, our disaster philanthropy playbook, our special reports, and our staff are always available to talk to you and help you out at the same time. And we have another webinar next week. So please join us next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern for our webinar that is Climate Refugees Supporting Receiving Communities. So looking at those places where refugees go when they're forced to leave because of a climate crisis. And so keeping this to an hour, respecting everyone's time. Want to thank our co-sponsors, Hakmal, Xiaowei, and Federico for taking the time to talk with us. Don't forget the survey. And if you have any questions that were not addressed today, please feel free to email me tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you. Have a great afternoon or evening, wherever you are. We appreciate you joining us so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.